Hello everybody, this is Earth Not a Globe number 3, the motive. Why would they lie about the globe? So a lot of people ask, what difference does it make whether the Earth is a spinning sphere or a stationary plane? This is a basic question which is eventually posed when people first stumble on this topic of debate. Those who are trying to debunk the truth involving the world being a fixed plane just don't understand the motive for such a grandiose, intricate deception. Physicists, astronomers, and government agencies and the educational system, just to name a few, would have no reason to lie, would they? There's no possible way that everyone could be so absurdly wrong for all this time, is there? Well, the basic obvious truth involving the world indeed being a stationary plane seems so absurd to the average person because we've all been brainwashed to believe the very contrary, and there's apparently no motive behind such an astronomical, preposterous lie. People find it way too unlikely that the entire world could either be lying or just downright incorrect about the very ground which they've always lived on. If people were given a choice in the matter, this position might hold some weight as far as I'm concerned, but we all know there's absolutely no choice involved with a federal test involving the world, the solar system, or the galaxy, and so on. Nobody chose to participate in the globe Earth model. Nobody I've ever met, anyways. On the contrary, all of us, every last one of us, was fundamentally forced into completely believing the world as a spinning sphere in outer space, starting on the first day of school, and in many cases long before then. Everyone I've ever known was forced to believe theoretical physics since the very beginning of school, and such beliefs are reinforced not just in the educational system, but also by mass media, popular films, shows, documentaries, and finally, even religions have been built up around the fallacious idea of infinite space and alien sci fi scenarios. This is sort of besides the point, but a man named L. Ron Hubbard, who was, well, a very strange and unusual science fiction author, L. Ron Hubbard ultimately penned a book called Dianetics, which is the outline of a New Age religion practiced by a ton of people, including many modern celebrities, in fact, a lot of the modern celebrities. Now, I'll admit I'm no expert on Scientology or their religious beliefs, but I've studied it enough to get a rough understanding of the typical Scientologist's paradigm. L. Ron Hubbard somehow convinced these people that all sorts of wild science fiction fantasies were true, including the notion that people were supplanted here by a master race of aliens, and by using repetitive psychoanalyst style sessions, people can essentially overcome their proverbial mental chains, according to Scientology.
Ronald DeWolf.
Ronald Edward DeWolf.
Are you the natural son of L. Ron Hubbard?
Yes, I am.
This is how your father originally gained his main source of income?
Yes, it was. But the problem there is a lot of his writing. He didn't really write as many words as he said he did. Through the early 50s, he used to tell everybody that he had written 7 million words of fiction. But in fact, it probably never exceeded 1 million words. And that a great deal of his income came from my mother, who and my grandfather, his father, who supported him.
Then much of that has been written and said about your father is a figment of his imagination, would you?
That's quite correct. My father's been married 3 times. I know in Scientology literature and what he tried to lead other people to believe in his writings of his biographies that he's only been married once to Mary Sue Hubbard, but he's been married 3 times. The true history of L. Ron Hubbard should come out and should be known by people. I'm talking about the documented facts and the actual occurrences of his lifetime, because he has built up over the years, since 1950, a great mystique, a great amount of false and imaginary data. I could say flatly that 99% of what my father wrote about his own life and what he had done is false.
Was he really in the war and shot up and healed himself with his own mind and
he was in the Navy during World War II, but he wasn't shot up.
Okay, what about his
Never wounded
educational
or
background?
blinded. Excuse me, sir.
Sir, are you finished?
No, I said he was never wounded or blinded.
Would you like to go into how far in college did he indeed go and what degrees does he have?
He spent a few months, as far as college is concerned, at George Washington University. And one of the major points that he has said that he has a degree in engineering. At one point, there was a degree in nuclear engineering. Now, of course, that changed. As far as any nuclear engineering is concerned, he only took one semester, and he received an F, as in failure, for the one semester. But the incidents in Dianetics, Modern Science and Mental Health came from generally from his imagination, and also the at least 2 attempted abortions on my mother. One I observed when I was around 6 or 7, and his other activities with other women. But as far as any research is concerned, he has said at various times that he had spent 30-some years researching it, but he didn't.
Well, it says that the book preys on mentally impaired or ill people, and Dianetics' book represents its methodology will cure more than 70% of all man's ills, and he's claimed it cured cancer, tuberculosis, arthritis, heart disease, retardation, and you can increase your IQ and etc. Do you think that he has been successful in any of these things?
He claimed it cured anything and everything.
Then the list could be larger, etc.
No, you see, Dianetics and Scientology, they can back up on this later a little bit, but Dianetics and Scientology is, according to Dad, the one and only true path to freedom, the one and only true alleviation of any aberration or human problem. It is the solution to anything that a human being may want to do, or he may have any sickness and illness. I know that over the years, I can remember in the 50s where we were putting across it would cure anything, including falling hair and dandruff, and but the lawyers and attorneys and the government were getting very uptight and very upset about us using the word cure, because the very first Dianetic Research Foundation in Elizabeth, New Jersey in 1950, that's one of the reasons it got closed up, and while Dad had to move on to Wichita, Kansas. But the main idea here was that we had to alter what we were selling out. There's a recurring theme here throughout his life here of what I've always termed fleeing in the night. That is that he grabbed whatever cash he could from the Elizabeth, New Jersey Foundation and went to Wichita, Kansas, and there with a Don G. Purcell and some other people formed up the Dianetic Research Foundation in Wichita, Kansas. Sarah and my father got into a tremendous divorce battle where Sarah was claiming the same things as an example that he had been doing with my mother many years before that, which is beatings, attempted abortions, etc. And he injecting air into his heart with a hypodermic, and also poisoning a bottle of whiskey. Both of them untrue and pure fabrication by my father. My father's only had one basic driving goal in any organization, and that is total and complete control. He could never share responsibility, sit on a board of directors, or even operate anyway in a group. And he felt he was being constrained, and he thought he was being confined, And he, quite literally, he was in terrible financial straits because he spent money like water. All of a sudden, one day, my father and Mary Sue, they emptied all the bank accounts. Now, he was only able to sign on one small bank account, but I remember my father talking about how he had gotten other people to empty them, and how he had forged the names on checks. But anyway, he had emptied the entire bank of all the bank accounts of the Wichita Dianetic Research Foundation, and did another one of his fleeing in the nights to Phoenix, Arizona. My father only knew how to do one thing, and that was to destroy people. I mean, he would not, he could not do anything lightly. To him, anybody who did anything against him, criticized him, he would just flat go after their throat.
And does he have any background, to your knowledge, to scientific background, that auditing could be a plausible and worthwhile medical or...
No, of course not.
Or,
no.
Okay. Just something he made up, then, auditing. Auditing is just something he made up, or...
Yes.
So then...
Now, Scientology's premises fundamentally hinge upon the Earth being a globe and the premise of infinite space. And when Scientologists die, it appears they believe they will start their own planetary colony in the stars, or some really bizarre crap of that ilk. The point is, L. Ron Hubbard is just one example of how intelligent, successful people can be completely roped in and fundamentally misled by an obvious lunatic who purports fantasies such as Scientology or Dianetics. If you look into the structured so-called religion of Scientology, they essentially treat the lower members of the church with a never-ending psychology session and proceed to milk them for all their money and use their celebrity drones like Tom Cruise or John Travolta to expand their gullible flock and to add legitimacy to their extremely bizarre worldview. People who have left the cult of Scientology admit that the super rich, intricately structured so-called religion is physically and psychologically abusive, dogmatic, and ultimately complete nonsense cooked up by a total kook who was arguably a Luciferian slash Mason slash Satanist. The Church of Scientology created by L. Ron Hubbard remains a thriving so-called religion to this very day. The reason I'm bringing up Hubbard and Scientology is because he was very much in bed with Jack Parsons, almost literally. There was some bizarre love triangle between L. Ron Hubbard and Jack Parsons' lady friends. Such gossip is beyond the scope and premise of this video, but there's a rather personal link between L. Ron Hubbard and Jack Parsons, to be sure. Now, the connection between Hubbard and Parsons is important to mention because Hubbard, Parsons, Aleister Crowley, and ultimately NASA are all very much interconnected. Parsons was the founder of JPL, or Jet Propulsion's Laboratory, which has always been an integral partner with NASA and appears to have aided their efforts to trick the world by faking space. When you realize that high-profile illuminists such as Hubbard and Parsons were elitist whack jobs, apparently into ritual magic and essentially Satanism, both of whom played a major role in altering the mainstream paradigm by blurring the line between science and science fiction, just as others like Hubble, the telescope guy who invented the galaxy, but they all contributed to this same effort of blurring the line between science and science fiction. Influential men of the early to mid-1900s were receiving great heaps of notoriety, prestige, and wealth, of course, for painting a wonderful picture of infinite space and related theological ramifications. For some of the younger viewers out there, this will probably come as a shock, but even just 20 or 30 years ago, people were extremely closed off to the idea of aliens or visitors from other worlds. Sure, you had a lot of sci-fi geeks and such, but the average person would call you a tinfoil hatter or worse for simply talking about UFOs or aliens. 20 years ago, you would easily be laughed out of the room if you tried to strike up a conversation with a random stranger about UFOs and aliens. If you compare that with now, the alien agenda, for lack of a better phrase, is so far advanced, there are large sections of the population who firmly believe that the human race itself was brought here or engineered by extraterrestrials from another world who created people as slaves to mine for gold on the earth, just as one example. When you realize the ancient alien line is very similar to that of Hubbard's Scientology and even Mormonism, it raises some fundamental questions about ancient alien theory and its main proponents. Getting back on point, people didn't always think this way in terms of aliens or infinite space. I've actually seen in my lifetime, and I'm 34, but I've seen in my lifetime the general consensus or the accepted view of reality incrementally changed to include such a widely varying number of schools of thought. I'm pretty sure you'll never find two conspiracy theorists who agree on everything, even if the two are both fans of ancient aliens, in which case they'll probably agree on such nonsense as intelligent transpermia, but they'll surely have their differences about whether they're little green men or little gray men. The opinion factories known as the mainstream media outlets are anything but factual. They've been working tirelessly on all of us since we were just little children, working to dominate the associations we form in our budding minds and manipulate our subconscious minds into ultimately conforming to and participating in the status quo. The status quo is what allows out of control, greedy corporations and useless government agencies to thrive, while we, the people, become more and more self enslaved and self infatuated, little by little, so as we don't really notice the mental chains we begrudgingly attach to our paradigm and carry with us wherever we go. Furthermore, the status quo has morphed from a relatively simple thing to an increasingly complex set of moral and intellectual deadweights designed to ensnare our curious, creative, pioneering spirit by distracting us with fantasy, intrigue, and lies. I honestly don't know if people like L. Ron Hubbard actually believed their science fiction, or if they simply cooked up all that craziness to distract people and to ultimately make money. I suspect it was probably the latter with Hubbard, so in other words, I don't think he actually believed that garbage, but when it comes to people like Jack Parsons, I find it rational to at least, hypothesize that he may have been a willful participant in this globe Earth lie, but on the other hand, perhaps he was just as misinformed as the next bloke over.
The whole thing is so incredible. The whole story is so amazing, so remarkable. This is Los Angeles. This is Black Magic. This is the founding of NASA, of Jet Propulsion Laboratories. What isn't in this story?
The craters and mountains of our moon bear the names of giants of science, figures like Archimedes, Kepler, and Copernicus. There is also a crater honoring someone called Jack Parsons. There are some who would rather he had been forgotten. Perhaps that's why his crater is on the dark side of the moon.
He was a maverick rocket scientist, okay? He was also a maverick rocket scientist spiritually.
This father of American rocketry was also an occultist, devoted to a path still widely misunderstood and feared.
So the founding of modern rocket science is absolutely allied and connected with black magic.
We really need to go back in time to see how this astronomically massive series of misunderstandings unfolded, and at what point did the misunderstandings become outright blatant lies. So if we go back to the era when Hubbard or Parsons were in grade school, this would be the early 1900s, I suppose they would have been fed the conventional narrative about a spinning globe Earth and probably subscribed to that model by force just like everyone else. I should mention real quick that it wasn't until the late 1920s when Hubble, not Hubbard, but Hubble, basically invented galaxies. Most globe earthers will cite Christopher Columbus, aka Cristobal Colon, who was a raving lunatic, murdered countless Native Americans for no reason, but most globe earthers will cite Christopher Columbus and his observations about the masts of approaching ships appearing over the horizon before the hull. Even a moderately prepared flat earther can prove that this phenomenon is perfectly aligned with the natural laws of perspective and is in no way indicative of a globe Earth. I'm certain that whatever the level of propaganda for the globe was then, in the early 1900s or so, it would certainly pale in comparison to the amount of glitter and pageantry surrounding the globe Earth lie in contemporary terms. The amount of programming and brainwashing involved with the modern doctrine of a spinning sphere Earth is astonishing, and the modern child often learns about the fallacious concept of planets and galaxies even before they learn how to walk or even speak. In fact, there's arguably a cross-section of the population who has their very first memories in life associated with the solar system mobile looming over their crib for the duration of their formative years. The mainstream media outlets have done a fantastic job to ensure that all children are constantly exposed to some degree of space propaganda or another, even before they venture out of the crib. At any rate, to see how this lie was formed over the years, to ask when this massive series of misunderstandings actually became a widely believed set of lies, is a good question. It's rather logical to consider that NASA's Apollo missions were the final nails in the coffin of the truth when they launched the Apollo missions and supposedly beamed back images of the blue marble Earth from halfway to the moon. In actuality, the Freemasonic astronauts were using trick photography to create the impression of a spherical Earth from rather nearby using simple trick photography and possibly high altitude flight capabilities. Now, I'll be the first to admit that most of the people at NASA are probably not involved with this deception, as all of them were being taught the globe Earth lie since long before there was such a thing called NASA. So we need to go back further and look at the construct and subsequent evolution of the compounded lie. I should also mention that people who work for agencies such as NASA are very much compartmentalized into their specific job or duty, and so therefore are inherently unaware of the big picture, even people towards the top of such organizations as NASA. Now, before we look back into history for the origins of the lie and the possible motives for it, I'm going to read a quote from astronomy.com involving the so-called axis of evil. And what this entails, and just in short, is that for some reason astronomers are terrified of the thought of some type of creator, or terrified of the thought of space not being an infinite, ever-expanding explosion. So, astronomers reveal cosmic axis of evil. Quote,
measurements used to weigh galaxy clusters carried out in 3 different wavelengths are giving rise to significantly differing results.
let me stop right here and remark how very laughable it is that astronomers actually believe they can weigh galaxies based on a figure known as the gravitational constant. I should point out that the gravitational constant was supposedly figured up by scientifical nonsense known as the Cavendish experiment. You can look into the Cavendish experiment if you want, but the basic premise of it involves an elitist physicist who professed to have weighed the Earth by hanging a couple of balls in his tool shed. Since there's no way to verify his results or falsify them, the conclusions reached by the Cavendish experiment are exactly pseudoscience and erroneous conclusions. By taking the results of the Cavendish experiment and extrapolating them out to describe the weight of the Earth, or distant galaxies no less, is the definition of arrogance, pseudoscience, and theoretical folly at once. So continuing with the axis of evil from astronomy.com, quote, this is by Liverpool John Moores University, United Kingdom, published Friday, July 1st, 2011.
Astronomers are puzzled by the announcement that the masses of the purportedly largest objects in the universe appear to depend on which method is used to,
quote,
weigh them. The new work was presented at a specialist discussion meeting on scaling relations of galaxy clusters organized by the Astrophysics Research Institute, or ARI, at Liverpool John Moores University and supported by the Royal Astronomical Society. Clusters of galaxies are
theoretically
the largest gravitationally bound objects in the
so-called
universe,
allegedly
containing thousands of galaxies like the
so-called
Milky Way.
And for some reason, physicists believe
Their weight is an important probe of the
so-called
dark matter content and evolution of galaxies through cosmic time.
So, end quote right there, real quick. Taking another quick moment to break this down, physicists are eagerly looking for this thing called dark matter. Similarly, they've been trying to find a single trace of so-called gravity waves for many, many decades before the postulation of such a thing called dark matter was ever raised. The reason they're so persistent on finding evidence of gravity or dark matter is because their entire existence as physicists depends on the perpetual search for theoretical proofs to confirm their theory of the universe. You simply cannot have a Big Bang, heliocentric galaxies comprising the universe without so-called gravity. Furthermore, you cannot have gravity without dark matter. In essence, celestial bodies are theoretically compelled to their orbits by the vast vacuum of space-time, acting as sort of a tether between the two bodies which otherwise are completely unrelated. In order for the heliocentric model to work, we must have this force called gravity, which has never been proven or even detected in reality, and so gravity only exists in theory to this very day. Now, such a force is only necessary on the spinning sphere Earth, which travels around the Sun in theory. Scientists assume that since we supposedly live on a spinning sphere in space, and the planets or wandering stars in the night sky appear to be spinning spheres in outer space, so they too must have gravity as well. The incomplete logic involved in theoretical physics, aka hypothetical surrealism, is abundantly clear to the moderately studious observer. The fact is, we couldn't possibly live on a spinning sphere in space, and so for scientists to believe there is some relationship or similarity between our world and the little dots of light in the night sky is beyond absurd. Simply put, the world we live on is inherently unique in the known universe. We live on the physical plane while the celestial bodies in the night sky exist on the astral plane. There's simply nothing in the night sky that is even remotely similar to our awesome and mysterious, massive world which exists in perfect harmony and perpetual balance with nature. Scientists assume that we live on a spinning sphere, but that's only because they've all been trained, like monkeys, since childhood to believe the fairy tale involving a spinning globular Earth. Someone told them when they were just little kids that we live on a spinning sphere, and that's what they continue to believe to this day, so they're not technically lying. Regardless of how smart they might have been or how much they may have disagreed with the assertions at first, even as gullible little children, every last person in the world, including by definition all the scientists, must take the heliocentric stance by default, or they certainly would have never graduated to become hypothetical physicists. Even though there's plenty of physical evidence to prove the world couldn't possibly be a spinning sphere, the conventional modern paradigm doesn't allow for anything other than the world to be a spinning sphere, which is exactly why science will never find a single trace of gravity, nor will it ever find a single trace of the so-called dark matter. For an analogy of gravity and dark matter, and how perpetually searching for their existence is folly and pseudoscience, I really love the dragon in my garage example. So, if I were to tell you I have a giant dragon living in my garage and invited you over to see it, you'd be excited, right? Okay, so when you come over and I do the whole drum roll thing and pop open the garage, you'd be pretty disappointed when there's nothing there, wouldn't you? You'd say I was mad when I started telling you more details about the dragon, right? Dude, there's nothing there. I don't see any dragon. You've lost your mind. That's what you'd say, wouldn't you? That's what I'd say. Well, that's because the dragon exists just outside the frequency of visible light, I reply with a proud certainty. Okay, so can I touch the dragon, you ask? Well, you could, but its biological material exists just outside the frequency of physical matter, so your vibrational state would simply pass through the dragon's vibrational state, and therefore you can't physically touch it. Well, this sounds like a bunch of crap to me, you replied. Well, it might seem that way, but I've developed an entire empire of theoretical physics surrounding the invisible dragon in my garage, and all the physicists in the world believe it's here, so it must be here. Furthermore, when theoretical physics begins frantically searching for invisible dragon droppings, this is identical to the paper chase which involves looking for dark matter or dark energy. The entire field of theoretical physics relies on the invisible dragon being perpetually not demonstrable and also not falsifiable, which in turn allows them to postulate all sorts of nonsense in order to make the invisible dragon in my garage seem credible, and it allows for them to continue being hypothetical surrealists with realistic funding. In other words, just because you can't see, touch, or smell the invisible dragon in my garage doesn't necessarily mean you can prove it isn't there. On the contrary, the very nature of the invisible dragon in my garage renders the entire theory as not falsifiable and therefore pseudoscience. This is exactly the same thing that goes on with gravity and dark matter. We experience what goes up must come down on the face of the earth, and so the spots of light in the night sky must also experience something very similar, if not identical, depending on the size and density of the given planet. Now, the illogical leap of faith here is so very abundantly clear to me, however, most people just assume that the little dots of light in the night sky are somehow similar to our world here on the physical plane on the ground. Since all scientists have been tricked into believing we live on one of those dots of light in the night sky, then all logic and common sense would dictate the necessity of gravity. On the other hand, since the world is demonstrably a stationary plane, the need for gravity goes right out the window, and the need for theoretical astrophysics and dark matter goes with it. The reason why scientists will continue looking for the proverbial dragon shit known as gravity or dark matter is because their entire field of study and, by extension, their survival as theoretical physicists depends on the existence of, or at least the never-ending search for, gravity waves or dark matter or dragon crap, and so their very existence depends on the perpetual search for invisible dragon shit. Continuing with the axis of evil quote from astronomy.com,
Measurements used to weigh these systems,
the so-called other galaxies,
are carried out in three different regions of the electromagnetic spectrum: X-ray, optical, and millimeter wavelengths, give rise to significantly different results. Eduardo Rosso from the University of Chicago explained that any two of the measurements can be made to fit easily enough, but that always leaves the estimate using the third technique well out of line. Dubbed the quote axis of evil, it is as if the universe is being difficult by keeping back one or two pieces of the jigsaw and deliberately preventing researchers from calibrating their
so-called
galactic weighing scales properly.
The reason they're having so much trouble is because their line of reasoning is fundamentally flawed, beginning with the very shape and nature of the ground which they've walked upon for their entire life, for crying out loud. Looking to theoretical physics for answers about our place in the universe or the meaning of life is akin to asking a blind man about his favorite color. Modern theoretical astrophysicists are still going on the nonsensical juvenile assumption that the Earth is a spinning sphere, just as they were tricked into doing since they were barely old enough to walk, speak, or wipe their own bottom. Continuing with the quote,
More than 40 of the leading cluster astronomers from the United Kingdom, Europe, and the United States attended the meeting to discuss the early results from the Planck satellite, currently scanning the heavens at millimeter wavelengths, looking for the smallest signals from clusters of
so-called
galaxies and the cosmic background radiation in order to understand the birth of the universe.
As if this is possible.
The Planck measurements were compared with optical images of clusters from the Sloan Digitized Sky Survey and new X-ray observations from the XMM Newton satellite.
There's good old Newton again.
So, ARI astronomers are taking a leading role in this research through participation in the X-ray cluster work and observations of the constituent galaxies using the largest ground-based optical telescopes. One possible resolution to the
so-called
axis of evil problem discussed at the meeting is a new population of clusters that is optically bright but also X-ray faint. Jim Bartlett from the University of Paris, who is one of the astronomers who presented the Planck results, argued that the prospect of a new cluster population that responds differently was a, quote, frightening prospect because it overturns age-old ideas about the gravitational physics being uniform from cluster to cluster.
Now, when they say age-old ideas, they just mean decades old, but what's the difference? Decades old, age-old, same thing, right? Anyways, I saw this meeting as, going back to the quote,
I saw this meeting as an opportunity to bring together experts who study clusters at any one wavelength and don't always talk to their colleagues working at other wavelengths.
This is what I mean when I say compartmentalized. Even people in such a very similar study don't even talk to one another about their findings, and so when you have compartmentalized science, you have a whole lot of room for problems and misinformation. Anyway, that quote was from Chris Collins from ARI.
The results presented are unexpected, and all three communities, optical, X-ray, and millimeter, will need to work together in the future to figure out what is going on.
End quote. The actual reason, according to me, the actual reason why physicists find natural observations, quote,
frightening,
is because their entire field of study and their very existence as astrophysicists hinges upon the totally fallacious assumptions involved with the globe-Earth logic. An entire field of study, a lucrative empire, has essentially been created around the invisible dragon in my garage, and scientists have been able to enjoy perpetual correctness since the theories and laws they're asserting are neither demonstrable nor falsifiable, and they'll simply change their story or add unnecessary complexity to their theorem if any problems arise, and this is all in order to perpetuate their existence as astrophysicists. Physics will simply never find proof of the invisible dragon in my garage because the damned thing doesn't actually exist in reality. In the same light, gravity and dark matter also do not exist in reality and couldn't possibly exist in reality, and there's really no theoretical need for them to exist if the Earth is not a spinning globe, which it isn't. Unfortunately, the dragon and its droppings, aka gravity and dark matter, will perpetually be a mystery just outside of theoretical physics' ability to prove or even observe, let alone document, simply because it's a phantom of the false, illogical heliocentric model. Furthermore, the never-ending search for gravity and dark matter provides them, the theoretical physicists, with a never-ending pile of possible places to hunt for, and hopefully slip face first into a giant pile of invisible, non-existing dragon poop. So that's one motive for the lie. Physicists will perpetually search for the unattainable, illogical proof of gravity or dark matter in order to remain existing as theoretical astrophysicists. They're still trying to find the very first bit of physical evidence for so-called gravity waves, and assert such evidence is always just outside the grasp of the current technology. We always need to wait another 5 years for the proof. And then, of course, when the 5 years is up, it's still just beyond the scope of our current technology to prove, but if we wait another 5 years, we'll surely have the proof we've been waiting for, and we'll eventually get a strong whiff of the invisible dragon droppings to prove the invisible dragon in my garage actually exists. Since we're obviously never going to find gravity waves, they're also searching for so-called dark matter, and even more absurd abstract concepts which perpetuate the need for theoretical physicists and their wild theories. Science was never intended to be a method to continue an erroneous perceived legitimacy of cockamamie theory. However, that's exactly what science, or at least theoretical physics or astrophysics, has ultimately become in our modern terms. But beyond that, beyond science being willfully ignorant and mesmerized by a spinning globe Earth and infinite space, there's a root cause to all this that predates every living theoretical physicist. In other words, modern scientists were misled about the spinning globe Earth since they were mere toddlers. They have no reason to question the so-called conventional wisdom, as all of their theories and belief systems are built upon this premise. So the question is how long has this been going on? How long has this premise been taught in the schools as factual? The Bible is clearly a flat earth book. There are tons of passages from the Bible which clearly describe a world created as a unique, stable, immovable, perfectly balanced physical plane with the sun and the other celestial bodies traveling in a circuit overhead upon which people can safely flourish. In turn, we, the people, are supposed to be the heralds of the earth, and we're intended to take care of the place that takes care of us, and to take care of our neighbors when they need our help, in the hopes that perhaps when the day comes that you need help, someone out there might take the call. Whether you agree with the Bible or not is irrelevant. The ancient books involved with the Bible are ultimately correct in terms of the natural world being a stationary plane, and the hierarchical religion of scientism has repeatedly mocked the Bible because it is indeed a flat earth book through and through. In looking after the world and respecting the Creator, we are in turn ensuring that we have a stable, safe place in which to live and to prosper and eventually pass on to our children once our days are spent. If science has effectively diminished our collective respect of the world, respect for the Creator, and respect for our very selves, then isn't it necessary to question the fundamental tenets of scientism as a belief system or a worldview? Or do we just gobble everything up scientism asserts as factual without thinking about it or verifying it? A lot of people, especially scientists for some reason, do not like the idea of intelligent design, which obviously implies some type of intelligent designer. You simply cannot have creation without a creator. You can't have DNA code without first having someone to write the code. Evidence for intelligent design is everywhere in nature, especially when you look at things like DNA. DNA is extremely complex code. Again, the obvious fact here is that you cannot have code without a coder to first write the code. Modern science includes Darwinism or evolution as factual, but neither of these fields of thought can actually tell you how non-biological material, such as rocks, can somehow morph into biological material, such as even the simplest of creatures, a single-celled organism. Even in its simplest form, biological material is extremely complex and very mysterious. Even a single-celled organism, such as an amoeba, are extremely complex. It's rather mind-boggling to consider exactly how many working parts are entailed there in a single-celled amoeba. Science will tell you that life is merely a cosmic accident, and given enough time and the right conditions, non-living material can obviously magically morph into living organisms. This is, of course, ridiculous, and nowhere can you demonstrate or repeat non-living material somehow evolving into living material. And furthermore, you can't find one single example of a dog giving birth to a not dog. Theoretical physicists invented the spinning Earth model to align with astronomical observations. However, contrary to popular belief, their theories are not the ultimate be-all end-all truth. In fact, all theorems are designed to align with the astronomical observations, and therefore you cannot use the astronomical observations as proof of the theorem. When you observe the stars overhead during the course of an evening, they apparently rotate around the North Pole once per day. So, in light of such an observation, you have one of two options, possibly other options we haven't considered, but at least these two. A, the Earth is spinning and the stars are stationary, or B, the stars are spinning and the Earth is stationary. Theoretically speaking, if the world is stationary and the known universe is spinning in circles concentric to our so-called North Pole, which for all intents and purposes is the very center of the flat world map, but if the celestial bodies are actually orbiting overhead while the world is stationary, this really sort of implies that the world itself is a large part of everything and is extremely special, wholly unique, and critically important in terms of the known universe. On the other hand, if the universe is essentially stationary, of course theoretically expanding in all directions in response to the so-called Big Bang, but if all the stars are basically stationary and we're the ones spinning, then the Earth is presumably a small part of nothing. For some reason, science is appalled or even terrified by the thought of a creator, or afraid of our world somehow being significant or possibly even unrivaled in the cosmos. I really don't understand this, but In response to this apparent fear, they construct complicated theorem and models around circumstantial evidence to base their paradigm and reinforce the widely accepted yet fundamentally flawed belief system involving the spinning globe Earth. Now, to be very honest, I don't have any problem with people believing a totally false version of reality. To each his own, I always say. But I do have a problem when science purports a completely false version of reality as factual, proceeding to brainwash the entire world into believing their line of assumptions, misunderstandings, and ultimately lies, which are purportedly supported by science. I personally would prefer to know the truth, but in many cases the truth is dangerous to the status quo, and anyone doing very well for themselves under the current system in no way wants to rock the boat, especially if they have many stakes planted in the given theoretical model. Such stakes could involve monetary, psychological, and other types of reasons why people really love the idea of infinite space. Theoretical physics is so far removed from the scientific method, I honestly think we should change the definition of the word science. Lying certainly entails the omission of critical facts, and that's exactly what scientism does. Any facts which contradict their hypothesis are discarded and ridiculed, but on the other hand, observations that seem to work in their model are touted as facts and given all the attention and funding needed to broadcast their ridiculous position to the world at large as somehow being factual. Peer review is a fundamental part of this dog and pony show, as peer review is only granted to proponents of the theorem and observations which align with the accepted model. Peer review is simply never focused on views which are contrary to the accepted belief system, meaning they simply reinforce the existing line of thought and conversely ostracize anything outside of such boundaries. It certainly doesn't hurt their position to mock ideas which haven't gotten the attention of peer-reviewed journals, but if you actually consider their position, it's inherently impossible for dissenting theories or observations to receive the praise and so-called legitimacy involved with peer review. The reason theoretical physicists will never admit gravity is a total fallacy and will continue searching for the proverbial dragon droppings like dark matter is because the search for the non-existing perpetuates the apparent need for their very existence as theoretical physicists. Furthermore, for a physicist to even consider the world being flat and stationary would instantly alienate them from their comfort zone and from their colleagues, which amounts to blind faith in a belief system accompanied by the egotistical benefit of perceived perpetual correctness. Science was never intended to involve supporting pseudo-scientific posturing or blatant speculation which theoretically inflates their ego, but the tenets for their position are not supported by any physical evidence and therefore is not science. Unfortunate as it may be, that's exactly what scientism has become. A person with major stakes grounded in the belief system of scientism will simply never admit they've been wrong about approximately everything, as they would instantly lose their perceived credibility and would cease to fit into their dogmatic cult of beliefs. Losing their government funding, aka welfare handouts, certainly doesn't lessen their motivation to perpetuate the status quo. This renders them the polar opposite of a true blue scientist, and actually renders them fundamentally biased observers, and indeed proves them to be dogmatic religious zealots, clinging to a position which has been thoroughly falsified, yet they've believed it since they were toddlers, so it must be the truth. So all this is describing a huge motive for science to perpetuate the lies. The lies allow them to continue existing and contributing to their perceived never-ending correctness by disproving the premises of their model while they flatly refuse to even consider the evidence. They will point to their never-ending search for invisible dragon droppings, which only provides them with a perceived need to exist, but doesn't actually accomplish anything in reality. This alone is a huge motive, however, it's not the only motive. I suppose it could be a logical series of misunderstandings which led to the belief in the world being a spinning sphere. It makes some degree of sense in a world devoid of the technology to prove or disprove it, and I could see how, without our modern technology, such a fantastic theory could make mainstream headway, although to the point of being taught in all schools as factual is a bit uncanny. On the other hand, now that we indeed have the technology to prove this thing one way or the other very conclusively, the entire scientific community is off in la la land searching for invisible dragon poop and will mock anyone who proves they are in a futile hunt for a theoretical absurdity. At any rate, it appears that science arrived at the spinning sphere Earth conclusion logically, however incorrectly, and unfortunately most of the proofs of the globe Earth/heliocentric theory are antiquated, outdated theoretical fantasies. Now that the average person indeed possesses the technology to either prove or contrarily to falsify the globe to the degree of absolute certainty, it's irrelevant because nobody worth their salt, according to scientism, would waste their time looking into such nonsense as the shape of the Earth. The truth is, if you try to show this particular truth to just about anyone, they will instantly assume that you're a madman and will often begin to try explaining the spherical Earth to you one way or the other, as if we've never been told about Columbus's observations involving the masts of ships, or the fact that the ancient Greeks postulated this theory a zillion years ago. The truth is, in order to disprove the globe Earth model, you really need to understand the globe Earth model, and trying to reconvince or re-brainwash a serious flat earther into once again believing they live on a spinning globe is impossible. This makes the serious flat earther seem stubborn or closed-minded, but that's really a misunderstanding. The reason that we serious flat earthers are so damn stubborn about this is because we've meticulously sorted through all of the supposed proofs of a spherical Earth, and regardless of how hard you may try to find a shred of evidence to support the heliocentric model, you simply cannot prove a false paradigm as factual. On the other hand, there's a world full of verifiable evidence that our home is indeed a fixed plane, but this notion is so far removed from accepted reality it becomes absurd to anyone even somewhat familiar with physics and science fiction, which are becoming more and more synonymous over the years. Theoretical physics, that is, and science fiction. It's much, much easier to trick 4.5 billion toddlers that the world is a spinning sphere than it is to reconvince a single serious flat earther that he or she lives on a spinning sphere in outer space, zipping through the cosmos at a zillion miles an hour. To be honest, if it wasn't for NASA and the relentless federal education system preying upon the illogical toddlers of all generations in modern history, we wouldn't have such a major problem getting this truth out. The sad part about this is by trying to help people and finally telling them the truth amidst a lifetime of outright lies and theoretical fantasies, they'll actually attack you and assume that they are far more intelligent because they know the world is a spinning sphere, just like the little globs of light they can see in the night sky, just like their teacher told them when they were 5. People are very serious about this. In their state of complete ignorance, denial, and absolute subservience to a belief system dreamed up by a bunch of dead dudes they've never even heard of, they will violently attack anyone who questions their said beliefs. This is the other motivation for the huge lie. In convincing the entire world since they were toddlers a humongous obvious lie, they create a fail-safe situation where the victims of the lie will violently protect themselves from the truth. By creating this major, willful dissociation between most people and the truth, you have a world full of autonomic puppets who will follow the suggestions of those unnamed few sitting on the tip-top of the modern power structure, and in their state of complete ignorance will guard the door to the very cell which encages them, proverbially speaking, of course. Whoever the people may be at the top, I'm convinced that they're getting a bit uncomfortable about all this coming to light. See, they're accustomed to getting a good laugh out of all the ignorant sheeple who violently protect the globe Earth lie. They've done such a masterful job of creating mindless repeaters and defenders of this whopping lie, and at this point, with so many people waking up to the truth, the very foundations of their power over the people is at stake, and so I don't think they're laughing too much about this one. Maybe, though. Maybe they think it's pretty funny because most people don't believe this. So, if mind control and perpetual correctness, along with all the fortune and glory involved with theoretical physics, isn't enough motive, seriously, what other line of work could you sit around pondering the stars in the night sky and actually get lucrative funding for it? Theoretical astrophysicists have it pretty good, if we're being honest. They never have to do an honest day's work in their entire career, and they never have to worry about their theories being falsified because such a thing is inherently impossible to prove or disprove. Plus, they've got government agencies like NASA constantly stroking their ego by releasing so-called scientific facts, which always seem to align with the theoretical models of any given time. There are empires and entire educational systems built around the globe Earth lie, not to mention government programs such as NASA. There's plenty of motive right there for science to continue down the path of futility by forever searching for invisible dragon droppings, forever waiting another 5 years for the expected proof of gravity or dark matter. But honestly, I don't even think this is enough motive. To me, if you look at the behavior of the United States government and the other international players on the world stage, it becomes pretty clear that the drama is all a distraction and a means to an end. The elitists who are running the show do not value human life or national sovereignty as you or I might value such things. They are concerned strictly with control and ultimately maintaining dominance over the billions of mindless drones and getting their cut of any value said automatons can dig up and hammer out of this world. When the U.S. military sent Admiral Byrd to the Antarctic for Operation High Jump back in the 1950s, I think it's reasonable to hypothesize them being totally shocked to find evidence of the world being a plane encircled on all sides by the Antarctic. They might have known such things prior to High Jump, but at this point, if there were any questions involved, they would have certainly been answered in spades when Byrd headed due south from the edge of Antarctica. Instead of broadcasting their actual findings, I believe they deemed it better to continue the lie, having several motives already mentioned in play. If there's one thing the military ain't, the military certainly ain't stupid. They're always thinking of ways to get a leg up on any opponent. Unfortunately, a standing army is such a grave threat to society because a standing army needs war to perpetuate the need for its own existence. Much like theoretical physicists needing the idea of infinite space, gravity, and dark matter to continue their existence, so too the world militaries need a constant threat, perceived or otherwise, in order to continue raking in the bucks. The military industrial complex, like any other conglomerate of corporations, must have constant annual growth in order to be considered successful and to continue as a corporation. Since the war machine is measured in profit margin, just like McDonald's or just like Burger King, they too must continue cranking out weapons of mass destruction and misinformation to continue existing. I find it reasonable to assume there might be vast amounts of land in all directions south beyond the outer semiplane or Antarctica. I find it very hard to believe there's any sort of physical dome in the sky which would have to meet with the ground somewhere south of Antarctica or beyond the edges of the outer semiplane. Eventually, in either case, when Admiral Byrd traveled far south into the deep reaches of Antarctica during Operation High Jump, he conceivably would have found evidence for one or the other, either vast amounts of land, possibly other worlds, like Earth right next door here on the ground, on the physical plane. I find it very hard to believe that Admiral Byrd crashed into a glass or metal dome because he actually returned back from the trip, if you believe the military's account of this journey. Now, I won't say there absolutely is not a physical dome in the sky. However, as I analyze the evidence and consider it over the last 6 months or so, I find it very unlikely. Many flat earthers will point to the biblical account of the so-called firmament or things like rainbows to prove there is a dome in the sky. In the case of the firmament, the original biblical intent behind the word, which was R-A-Q or rock or rakia, R-A-Q-I-A, if I'm spelling that right, don't speak Hebrew. But the intent behind that word translated to firmament was simply describing an expanse or an astral plane where the stars reside. In the case of rainbows, this would be consistent with the electromagnetic field of the Earth, the flat Earth, being toroidal in shape, rising from the North Pole out to all the edges of the South Pole, and would necessarily form a dome-like shape. Since the world is demonstrably not a spinning globe, absolutely not, and there's probably not a physical dome in the sky based somewhere outside of Antarctica, that means there's probably more land out there beyond the Antarctic. And, even if there is a physical dome in the sky that ends somewhere south of the Antarctic, there's still gobs and gobs of more land out there. Now, if you fail to see the motive at this point, let me just spell it out. In the case of Admiral Byrd, whether he ran into the side of a dome or simply found vast tracts of inhabitable land beyond the outer semiplane, he would have certainly found concrete evidence that the world isn't a globe. By flying south from Antarctica, if you don't begin to head north at some point after traveling in a straight line away from the so-called North Pole, any navigator would realize there is no South Pole on the bottom of a sphere, but instead the South Pole is found at every point along the outermost edge of the world map. You see, this would conclusively prove the world to be a plane, and again, the military ain't stupid. Since the 1950s, the world military powers have all signed off on the Antarctic Treaty directly after Operation High Jump. This effectively limits the traffic to the already inaccessible and inhospitable area known as Antarctica. You're not going to pop into Antarctica on your way to work, and so by simply keeping the area out of the public mind, most of us live our entire lives located in the center of the world map and would never even dream of going to Antarctica for any reason. Those of us who have gone to Antarctica have done so on essentially a guided tour thanks to the US or some other world military power, and you absolutely cannot travel to the Antarctic on your own accord and volition. Most people in the world live in the cities found in the northern hemisphere or the central semiplane, and so as long as travel to Antarctica is strictly monitored and impeded by the world's militaries, it's pretty easy to keep us here in the center, herded like cattle, none the wiser that anything is amiss. Let me put it to you in the form of a question. Now that we've sort of talked about this, can you think of any reason why the world governments would want to hide the flat earth reality if there are indeed huge quantities of uncharted land beyond the southern icy region of the world? If we could all make a decision whether to spend the rest of our lives here in this world amidst the total insanity and injustice we must endure on a daily basis, or we could choose, contrarily, to travel to untouched, unexplored worlds right here on the physical plane, maybe even right next door. What if there was actually a totally obtainable frontier right here on the ground? Not millions of light years through theoretical space-time, but just beyond the southern region. Since the celestial bodies are proven to be rather close, all within about 6,000 miles or less, for all intents and purposes according to the calculations using plane trigonometry, and all the said stars are constantly encircling the world in rings concentric with the North Pole, it becomes absurd to even think about trying to visit them. There's no purpose in space travel, just as there's no purpose in NASA. You can still be a fan of science fiction, which is good because the genre is about to get much more robust and interesting. Either way, the world military powers have been hiding something in the far southern region. Whether it's the fingerprint of a creator in the form of the edge of a dome, or if it's the fact that we're not bound here to the Earth as an enclosed system with no escape, either one of these findings would apparently be proper motivation for the world military powers to keep us totally snowed. The globe model has a lot going for it, of course. People simply do not believe you when you ask the tough questions or even flat out prove to them that the world is a stationary plane. Most people will actually attack and ridicule you for asking such questions or proving the verifiable truth. This fact arguably has a lot to do with the Apollo missions, which came decades after High Jump, but the Apollo missions were certainly a series of complete lies inflicted upon the world by NASA. So, if the globular spinning Earth was a series of misunderstandings up to High Jump, then the Apollo missions were certainly well into the point where the misunderstandings had been distorted into a series of intricate lies.
Of all the footage of Apollo 11 requested from NASA over a 5-year period, one gem was discovered just before the completion of this documentary. An old reel received by mistake. It contains the raw or unedited footage of the crew of Apollo 11, Michael Collins, Edwin Aldrin Jr. and Neil Armstrong, staging part of their mission for nearly an hour in living color, with exceptionally clear behind-the-scenes audio of conversations discussing the techniques used to achieve a disingenuous picture depicting the Earth at a distance, in order to falsely demonstrate their far journey from it and their ability to survive passing through the Van Allen radiation belts. It cannot be misconstrued that this staging was done for some other reason prior to the mission, for the reel itself is slated and dated July 18th, 19th and 20th, 1969, the very days of the mission when they were said to be approaching and achieving lunar orbit.
First of what may be as many as 10 million families per year. Is setting out on its epic voyage into man's newest frontier for civilization, space. And from all over the world, correspondents have gathered to voice their enthusiasm for this show. Adventures farther out in concept than television has ever gone before. You can say it in any language. Lost in Space is a top-budget, top-quality show designed to dazzle the eye and ear with the most impressive production values and spectacular effects ever lavished on any TV series. We've put it on the launching pad for the new season in a trajectory aimed at the mass family market, appealing to every age group with entertainment as unusual as it is exciting. Only a few years ago. For now we live in the space age. Mr. and Mrs. Average American and all their kids have marveled at the heroic exploits of our pioneer astronauts. They're ready to project themselves into the foreseeable future with this family of space explorers. If you're wondering about a certain lack of animation in their expressions, it's because they've been frozen solid to survive the tremendous time span of travel to another galaxy. A journey interrupted en route when their ship is blasted by a barrage of meteors. Battered off course, they're drawn into the orbit of a mystery planet. The Robinson family, space shipwrecked on this alien, forbidding soil in the year 2000 AD, and your audience will be with them all the way, sharing their action-packed adventures. For instance, wouldn't Dad like to use this gadget to beat that throughway traffic? It's the jet-propelled rocket belt worn by Guy Williams, who made his mark as Zorro and now plays space scientist John Robinson, resourceful father of this castaway family.
So, we've all been taught to associate a blue marble with our home, which was indeed a rather low blow since people had no reason to think the astronauts or NASA would be lying. In fact, people were systematically prepared for space travel during the decades leading up to the Apollo missions. Predictive programming is very potent if repeated frequently and across the massive mainstream media outlets. The masses, especially in the United States, were primed and ready for the deception, thanks to the predictive programming in the form of popular sci-fi themes and, of course, theoretical physics. More recently, they've been laying the whole alien invasion thing on pretty thick, especially in the last couple of decades. So we can very possibly expect some type of a false flag alien invasion during our lifetimes. When the Illuminati assholes have played all their other cards, they'll probably release the hordes of humanoid clones from the permanent installations dug into the outermost semiplane or Antarctica. Of course, I'm being sarcastic and overdramatic here, but we really can't rule anything out given the level of technology possessed by the world military powers, including cloning, flying vehicles, anti-gravity vehicles, and that sort of thing, which are extremely possible. At any rate, their technology far surpasses anything we could even imagine in civilian terms. They certainly want to keep their control over the minds of the people, and I believe that up until recently they've been rather comfortable about the whole thing. They know that most people are not intelligent enough, or at least not motivated enough, to actually consider this truth with an open mind. They know that instead, most people will violently guard the very chains that enslave them, preventing anyone trying to break them free with this simple, obvious truth about the natural world. People often ask me, why do you care? What difference does it make what shape the world is? To me, it makes a huge difference, and I care because I hate lies almost as much as I hate moronic people who are totally incorrect trying to teach me something about physics. I honestly relate to the sense of humor involved with the liars because many of the mindless repeaters out there are extremely vulgar, stubborn, and wholly illogical. In truth, I even care about them, the billions of automatons, because they have been viciously fooled for the duration of their life, and they really don't understand what the hell they're talking about. People actually believe that if they can memorize the facts to pass a test, they are somehow smarter or more correct than they were previously. In truth, regardless of how well you did in school or how clever you might deem yourself to be in terms of physics, you have been tricked about basically everything for your entire life. If you think I'm crazy because you know the Earth is a spinning globe, then try to debunk it. Try to prove the world is anything but a fixed plane. I challenge you. In closing, I should point out that plugging your ears and closing your eyes, effectively burying your head in the sand, doesn't prove anything except a biased, willfully ignorant observer. Name-calling, ridicule, mockery, and slander also do not amount to proof. In order to prove the world is a spinning globe, you'll need to go further than the typical arguments, such as the masts of ships observed by Columbus, circumnavigation, or the Coriolis effect, just to name a few, as these so-called proofs are simply blatant misunderstandings. You'll really need to dig deep and scrutinize everything you've been led to believe as factual for your entire life, starting when you were a toddler. In doing so, in scrutinizing these assumptions, hopefully you'll realize the major flaws involved with heliocentrism, the Big Bang, and of course evolution, just for a few examples. And by scrutinizing these assumptions, I hope you come closer to the truth. If you failed to realize the motive for such a fantastic lie up to this point, I hope and pray that you have an understanding that there are possibly motives for this, one for theoretical physics, and two for the world military powers to continue with the lie. There is motive, if for no other reason than control, and ultimately to cap off our pioneering, infinitely curious nature at the bottom of a spinning sphere with no escape, which only exists in theory but none of us have ever lived on. In truth, nobody has ever seen a ball with a circumference of 25,000 miles, and certainly nobody has ever lived on one. If we did live on such a spinning sphere, there would be abundant physical evidence to support the theory, and in fact, all of the evidence points to the Earth being flat and stationary. I invite you to check out some of my other videos entailing obvious proof of the world's lack of curvature and orbital motion. Check out the cards by clicking on the white circle with the letter I inside towards the top right corner of the screen. In response to the request of many of my subscribers, I've set up a fan funding account where you can help me in my quest to expose the truth. On the other hand, if you use PayPal and you'd like to support this channel, you can pledge any amount directly to mollyeelance@gmail.com, or again, you can use the Google fan funding option. It's all pretty easy. I should add, this isn't mandatory and only applies to people who want to contribute to my efforts, which allows me to continue dedicating my life to promoting the truth. I've set this up for people who asked for it and voluntarily want to help, and I will never put a gun to anyone's head and force them to watch my videos or support my efforts. I really appreciate those of you who have contributed so far. It really goes a long way and it means a lot to me, and if you want to see me continue making videos surrounding this topic and others, I really can't do it without your help. So really thank you so much, and peace.
Through the early 50s, he used to tell everybody that he had written 7 million words of fiction, but in fact, it probably never exceeded 1 million words, and that a great deal of his income came from my mother, who and my grandfather, his father, who supported him.
Then much of that has been written and said about your father is a figment of his imagination, would you?
That's quite correct. My father's been married 3 times. I know in Scientology literature and what he tried to lead other people to believe in his writings of his biographies that he's only been married once to Mary Sue Hubbard, but he's been married 3 times. The true history of L. Ron Hubbard should come out and should be known by people. I'm talking about the documented facts and the actual occurrences of his lifetime, because he has built up over the years since 1950 a great mystique, a great amount of false and imaginary data. I could say flatly that 99% of what my father wrote about his own life and what he had done is false.
Was he really in the war and shot up and healed himself with his own mind? And
he was in the Navy during World War II, but he wasn't shot up.
Okay, what about his educational background?
Blinded. Excuse me, sir.
Sir, are you finished?
I said he was never wounded or blinded.
Would you like to go into how far in college did he indeed go, and what degrees has he had?
He spent a few months, as far as college is concerned, at George Washington University. And one of the major points that he has said that he has a degree in engineering. At one point, there was a degree in nuclear engineering. Now, of course, that changed. As far as any nuclear engineering is concerned, he only took 1 semester, and he received an F, as in failure, for the 1 semester. But the incidents in Dianetics, Modern Science and Mental Health came from generally from his imagination, and also the at least 2 attempted abortions on my mother. One I observed when I was around 6 or 7, and his other activities with other women. But as far as any research is concerned, he has said at various times that he had spent 30-some years researching it, but he didn't.
Right, it says that the book preys on mentally impaired or ill people, and Dianetics' book represents its methodology will cure more than 70% of all man's ills, and he's claimed to have cured cancer, tuberculosis, arthritis, heart disease, retardation, and you can increase your IQ and etc. Do you think that he has been successful in any of these things?
He claimed it cured anything and everything.
Then the list could be larger, etc.
No, you see, Dianetics and Scientology, I can back up on this later a little bit, but Dianetics and Scientology is, according to Dad, the one and only true path to freedom, the one and only true alleviation of any aberration or human problem. It is the solution to anything that a human being may want to do, or he may have any sickness and illness. I know that over the years, I can remember in the 50s.
Nobody chose to participate in the globe Earth model. Nobody I've ever met, anyways. On the contrary, all of us, every last one of us, was fundamentally forced into completely believing the world is a spinning sphere in outer space, starting on the first day of school, and in many cases long before then. Everyone I've ever known was forced to believe theoretical physics since the very beginning of school, and such beliefs are reinforced not just in the educational system, but also by mass media, popular films, shows, documentaries, and finally, even religions have been built up around the fallacious idea of infinite space and alien sci-fi scenarios. This is sort of besides the point, but a man named L. Ron Hubbard, who was, well, a very strange and unusual science fiction author, L. Ron Hubbard ultimately penned a book called Dianetics, which is the outline of a New Age religion practiced by a ton of people, including many modern celebrities, in fact, a lot of the modern celebrities. Now, I'll admit I'm no expert on Scientology or their religious beliefs, but I've studied it enough to get a rough understanding of the typical Scientologist's paradigm. L. Ron Hubbard somehow convinced these people that all sorts of wild science fiction fantasies were true, including the notion that people were supplanted here by a master race of aliens, and by using repetitive psychoanalyst style sessions, people can essentially overcome their proverbial mental chains, according to Scientology.
Ronald DeWolf.
Ronald Edward DeWolf.
Are you the natural son of L. Ron Hubbard?
Yes, I am.
This is how your father originally gained his main source of income?
Yes, it was. There are, but the problem there is a lot of his writing. He didn't really write as many words as he said he did. These where we were putting across it would cure anything, including falling hair and dandruff. And but the lawyers and attorneys and the government were getting very uptight and very upset about us using the word cure, because the very first Dianetic Research Foundation in Elizabeth, New Jersey in 1950, that's one of the reasons it got closed up, and while Dad had to move on to Wichita, Kansas. But the main idea here was that we had to alter what we were selling out. There's a recurring theme here throughout his life here of what I've always termed fleeing in the night. That is that he grabbed whatever cash he could from the Elizabeth, New Jersey Foundation and went to Wichita, Kansas, and there with a Don G. Purcell and some other people formed up the Dianetic Research Foundation in Wichita, Kansas. Sarah and my father got into a tremendous divorce battle where Sarah was claiming the same things as an example that he had been doing with my mother many years before that, which is beatings, attempted abortions, etc. And he injecting air into his heart with a hypodermic and also poisoning a bottle of whiskey. Both of them untrue and pure fabrication by my father. My father's only had one basic driving goal in any organization, and that is total and complete control. He could never share responsibility, sit on a board of directors, or even operate anyway in a group. And he felt he was being constrained, and he...
Hello, everybody. This is Earth Not a Globe number 3, The Motive. Why would they lie about the globe? So, a lot of people ask, what difference does it make whether the Earth is a spinning sphere or a stationary plane? This is a basic question which is eventually posed when people first stumble on this topic of debate. Those who are trying to debunk the truth involving the world being a fixed plane just don't understand the motive for such a grandiose, intricate deception. Physicists, astronomers, and government agencies and the educational system, just to name a few, would have no reason to lie, would they? There's no possible way that everyone could be so absurdly wrong for all this time, is there? Well, the basic obvious truth involving the world indeed being a stationary plane seems so absurd to the average person because we've all been brainwashed to believe the very contrary, and there's apparently no motive behind such an astronomical, preposterous lie. People find it way too unlikely that the entire world could either be lying or just downright incorrect about the very ground which they've always lived on, If people were given a choice in the matter, this position might hold some weight as far as I'm concerned, but we all know there's absolutely no choice involved with a federal test involving the world, the solar system, or the galaxy, and so on.